Hello and welcome back. In the first segment of this week's presentation, we talked about some of the reasons why processes of truth-telling are perceived as a problem rather than as a solution, and why sometimes there are reasons why states and incoming regimes might prefer a process of keeping truth quiet, a policy of forgiving, forgetting that emphasizes reconciliation over truth-telling. And what I want to do in this segment is to talk about some instances in which that strategy has been tried, why it was done, and what happened. So the first instances that we have of moratoria placed on processes of prosecution or on processes of truth-telling were, first of all, in Spain after the death of Francisco Franco, who had held the position of dictator for several decades, after winning a very intense civil war that had wide participation on all sides and after a long period of repression. And the decision was made by the regime that entered into power in 1975, first of all, that they would pursue reform with the aim of creating a democratic political order, and second, that they would try to avoid recrimination and any processes that could lead to intensification of social conflict by simply putting an end to the period, saying that it is over, that there are going to be no prosecutions, no large-scale investigations, that people would not be encouraged to talk about or memorialize experiences of suffering during the period of the Civil War or of the dictatorship. What happened in Spain was that this policy held for a long time, but there was consistent effort on the part of several citizens groups, of some prosecutors and of some judges to undermine it and to find ways around the moratorium, some of which were partly successful, all of which were controversial. But one of the things that it meant is that elements of the past, when they were raised, tended to attract attention, to be more controversial than they might be if they were part of an ordinary process. Another thing that happened is that memorialization, although it was not encouraged, did continue to occur, but occurred underground in the form of cultural representation rather than legal or political initiatives. If you look at some other cases, especially post-regime cases in South America, in Argentina after the end of the last period of military rule in 1983, and in Chile after the defeat of the Pinochet regime in 1990. Sorry, here's Stanislav. He's here to help me lecture. What you saw there, in Argentina, there was a period of investigation. There was a truth commission, a period of prosecution. One of the things that resulted from this was rebellion on the part of some portions of the military and police, in particular on the part of older and more experienced officers who were aware of their openness to charges of complicity and who felt threatened, attempted a rebellion. As a result of this, you saw several periods in Argentina in which the government attempts to place a moratorium on further legal activity. This calms down the military and police for a while, but the human rights groups, the legal groups, are always looking for ways to undermine the moratorium. They find it, activity begins again, another moratorium is imposed. This has happened at least in 3 instances since the end of the military regime in 1983. In Chile, there was a decision at the time of transition that there would be no prosecution, but instead a truth commission would be appointed that would produce a very comprehensive report. And this would substitute for the process of holding people to criminal responsibility. Similarly to the cases of Argentina and Spain, in Chile, the moratorium held for a while, but people have been looking for ways, other venues, other strategies to undermine it. So one message that we possibly get from this is that in the pioneer cases of people attempting to impose moratoria, that is to impose a system of forgiving, forgetting, and move on, it doesn't hold. There is too much pressure from different places in the society to prevent it from holding. This pattern is repeated in some other cases, but if you want to look at some other post-conflict, post-regime cases with moratoria, we can see one that basically holds and one that partly holds. In Mozambique, there was a shared sense among the people coming into political power that raising any questions, any grievances, any kind of large-scale investigation would be likely to result in a rebellious response, would be likely to result in a resumption of hostilities. And this was especially dangerous because the incidents of violence in Mozambique were ones that involved high levels of public participation. And at the same time, this was a state that found itself in a number of difficulties for political insecurity and economic reasons. So other priorities took over. And that meant that the policy of forgiving and forgetting was able to succeed, at least in part, because it was a policy of neglect, and neglect that was perhaps, among a critical part of the population, perceived as benign neglect. In Cambodia, where the scale of violence committed by the Khmer Rouge regime was enormous, the incoming regime resisted investigation and prosecution, at least partly because of fear of political division and the resumption of hostility, and probably at least in part simply because of the lack of political will. What happened in Cambodia is that eventually an international tribunal was established, but this international tribunal was always held as being suspect. It was looked on as an international initiative that did not have a lot of domestic legitimacy, and it was consistently undermined, not only by the people charged by this tribunal and by allies, but by the Cambodian government itself. And what you see then in Cambodia is now, even it's 40 years since the end of the Khmer Rouge regime, the existence of a narrative that is still strong in the public, that justifies violence, and that sees efforts at promoting truth-telling or justice as a form of interference. And this is a pattern that probably also applies in much of the former Yugoslavia. These are some of the more recent instances that we have of efforts at truth-telling and efforts at resistance to processes of truth-telling. And one of the things that happens in Serbia when there is a change of regime in 2000, they elect a new president, Vojislav Koštunica, who is seen as kind of a compromise. This is somebody who comes out of the democratic opposition, but is broadly sympathetic to a lot of the goals of the far-right nationalists who he replaces. Among the demands placed on the incoming regime internationally is what's called confrontation with the past. This becomes translated in practical policy to collaboration with demands for extradition of suspects and production of information to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. The incoming president, Vojislav Koštunica, comes up with what he thinks is a compromise. He says we are going to minimize this cooperation that is demanded, and instead what we are going to do is appoint a commission to investigate the causes, the conduct, and the consequences of violence. And this is a commission that has an extremely broad mandate, ranging from the question of how many languages are contained in the group of languages that was at one time predominantly labeled as Serbo-Croatian, to the question of whether Yugoslavia in its various incarnations was an ethnically balanced or unbalanced state, and so on. That is, it was an attempt to drown the significance of the violence that was of concern in a complex of other facts. The results of this commission are easy to report because there are none. In the first days after the commission was formed, two of its most prominent members resigned. The commission never held public hearings, never produced a report. It was a non-starter, and it was probably a non-starter because of the perception that it was generally not legitimate. What you did see on the local level was the appointment of different commissions designed to produce partial or tendentious versions of the truth or tellings of events. One of these was appointed by the government of Republika Srpska. This is the ethnic Serb entity in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this was a report that was intended to be used for the defense of suspects before the International Criminal Tribunal who were faced with charges of genocide and related crimes for the mass killings in Srebrenica in 1995. In 2002, this commission, we say commission, but it probably has just one person as an author, comes out with a report that could best be characterized as denial. It minimizes the number of victims. It says that civilian victims were military victims. It tries to explain away the existence of civilian victims. It was not a credible report. It was submitted as evidence in one case before the International Criminal Tribunal, and the judges in their verdict mentioned this report and said it was one of the worst examples of revisionism they had seen. As a result of this, the government of Republika Srpska was instructed by the International High Representative in Bosnia and Herzegovina to appoint a commission to do a proper report on Srebrenica, which they did. And a report was produced in 2004, which is actually fairly comprehensive and fairly accurate. It's the only commission appointed on the territory of the former Yugoslavia to have produced a report. It was followed by an apology from the president and from the parliament of Republika Srpska. In the last few years, there has been an effort in Republika Srpska to revoke support for this report, to appoint another commission that would produce a revised version of this report, that is to try to undo the work that was done. What this shows is the fragility of attempts at truth-telling in atmospheres of political contestation and instability. In the meantime, there was growing dissatisfaction with an effort to confine efforts at truth-telling to initiatives in criminal justice, and so an initiative was started as a coalition of victims groups, survivors groups, veterans groups, and human rights groups across the territory of the former Yugoslavia for the appointment of a region-wide commission to establish facts. They avoided using this term truth commission and the word truth, because I think they were conscious of the dangers that were discussed in the first part of this presentation. They had a project of collecting 1 million signatures from around the region and presenting them to the presidents and parliaments of the states in the region. This initiative did not succeed completely. They collected about 400,000. Most of the signatures, the overwhelming majority of signatures that they connected, interestingly, were from Serbia and from Kosovo. So these were the places where, for various reasons, there was most interest in this initiative. And after that, the initiative has continued, sort of, but it's a reasonable prediction that this regional commission is not likely to be created or to be founded. Having said that, they continue to hold hearings and discussions and forums and panels and so on in which issues are discussed. So it would not be possible to say that the initiative for the regional commission has done nothing. I raise these because in the context of efforts both at truth-telling and of forgiving, forgetting, suppressing memory, we're able to see some of the complications that enter into situations. They are not all complications that have to do with the character of truth. Some of them have to do with the character of political contestation. So these are examples of efforts where containing memory has been attempted and has partly succeeded or failed. In the next segment, I want to talk about some of the arguments that are offered against the establishment of memory and of truth, of public recognition and promotion of this recognition.